and State TV here at City and State's SOMOS 2014 hub in beautiful San Juan, Puerto Rico. We're joined now by State Senator Mike Gianaris. Senator, thank you so much for joining myself and my colleague Gerson Borrero.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being part of the minority now. How does it feel to be a minority, Senator?
You forget, we were already. It's complicated, but we were already. We'll get there. We'll persevere.
You know, I mean, I hesitate to ask you the same questions that probably everyone's been asking in the last couple of days, and it's not about a pile-on, but I mean, you know, what do you think, what are the lessons that you've taken away from this election?
Well, it's a good question. The biggest lesson is we've got to figure out a way to get people out to vote. I mean, the drop off in turnout was so dramatic, it's like nothing we've ever seen. They said here in New York, lowest turnout we've had since World War II. And that was while the war was going on. People weren't even in New York to be voting. So we had a dramatic turnout drop, and it all happened to be on our side, which hurt us, obviously, at the polls. 1 million fewer votes cast than 4 years ago. Astorino matched Palladino's numbers, which means all that million came off the Democratic side of the ledger. You lose 1 million votes in a 3.6 million turnout election, you're going to lose elections.
You know,
frankly, it's somewhat of a minor miracle that we won to pick up in Buffalo, and we held on to people like George Latimer, who had a lot of money dumped in their race by the Republicans as well.
You know, Senator, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because that's my number one takeaway from this election, that we have a crisis in New York State. I've been saying that we had a crisis because we're 49th or 50th already in voter participation. Now, if there were more states, we would be like 60th. And so, you know, we hear about these measures, early voting, same-day registration, internet voting, you know, but no one seems to take the bull by the horns and to make this like their signature issue. I was asking the borough president, Ruben Diaz Jr. yesterday, whether he was going to use his clout with the governor to push the governor to make this one of his signature issues. What can we do to make this, take this out of the realm of ideas and make it in a reality?
Well, I have a couple things to say about that. Number one, I beg to differ slightly. I've actually championed a lot of those bills and have my name on them in the Senate. Back when I was in the Assembly, I chaired a subcommittee on voter disenfranchisement. So whether it's early voting or vote by mail or excuse-free absentee voting, we've introduced bills to do all that. The sad truth about what happened on Tuesday is that those who now have power in the Senate are the biggest opponents to those measures. As we saw from the results themselves, Republicans benefit when fewer people come out to vote. And so now that they're in power, it's going to be harder than ever to get those things done, but we're going to roll up our sleeves and do what we have to advocate for.
Oh, don't get me wrong. I'm going to say the same thing to Senator Skelos, and I mean, I do hold him just as accountable.
But he's not here.
But, you know, many elected officials or people who are politicos will say that they think that incumbents in general are not in favor of higher voter turnout because it tends to benefit re-election campaigns, and that both parties are in cahoots to not make sure that as many people participate in the process.
There are a lot of issues on which incumbents versus non-incumbents is more the division than Democrats versus Republicans, but I don't think this is one of them, at least not on the Senate side. We had many of our incumbents that just lost these elections who would tell you the opposite. And Senator Kachik in particular has been a champion of a lot of election reform issues. So we just think the more people vote, the better it is for democracy. That's the purpose of what we do. Some of these other countries in the world, their voter turnouts are so dramatically higher than what we have. It's an embarrassment that we pride ourselves on being the strongest and best democracy in the world. We can't even get people out to vote. And not only that, but we put obstacles in people's way to get out to vote. You see it in some other states even more dramatically than here in New York. But even here, I think, unfortunately, it becomes a partisan thing because Republicans tend to benefit when the turnout is the lowest.
But regardless of what the apparatus is and what switches, you know, how comfortable you make it, whether online or if you change the ballots and whatever you do, the reality is that the stimulus to the electorate wasn't there. And it started with the top of the ticket. So you have a sitting governor, Democrat, who should have been stimulating. It may turn out with the final numbers that Thomas DiNapoli, the state controller, actually wound up may get more votes than the actual governor. So, you know, it may be something to do with the voting and the access, but there's also not, a stimulant factor here. Having said that, in terms of what we call arroz y habichuela, getting down to the real deal, what does it mean? The majority, minority, whatever it is, the people that voted for all of you in the respective districts in the Senate, what does it mean in the real factor here in terms of what the services or the issues that you were elected to represent? Because it could care less. I mean, we're watching right now. We're streaming live here from SOMOS. You're in San Juan, and we're still talking you know, the nitty-gritty of the political process. But the reality is, how does this impact of the person back in your Senate district?
Well, it has a great impact, and we tried to make those points during the election, whether it's protections for women and women's rights, simply codifying a law that's been in existence in the U.S. for 40 years to make sure that the Supreme Court doesn't erode protections for choice for women. Now it's going to be more difficult to get that done. Raising the minimum wage to a point where people can actually provide for their families, and giving the opportunity for that minimum wage to increase with inflation over time, it's going to become more difficult now to get that done. We're here in Puerto Rico. I know there's a great interest in the DREAM Act and immigrants' rights, another issue on which is going to become a lot more difficult now to get progress. And we talked about election reforms, which is yet another issue. But on issue after issue, unfortunately, we lost that 2-year window when we succeeded in 2012 to win the majority, had a majority of Democrats in the chamber, but because the Republicans continued to have authority over what came to the floor for a vote, we lost the opportunity.
But that authority was also part of a certain sector, you know, that was led by Jeff Klein in terms of the Independent Democratic Conference to go with them to give them that majority. So it was your own people from your own party screwing you. Come on.
I don't think a lot of people would suggest Jeff Klein is our people.
Oh, but he's a Democrat, isn't he?
He's a Democrat, and look, what happened 2 years ago is history. It's why we didn't get some of these things done, we believe. Where we are now is that the Republicans have an outright majority in the Senate, so we have to live with that reality for now and do the best we can with Dean Skelos calling the shots.
Didn't he give you an interview that we just...
You know, well, we just posted an interview at cityandstateny.com with the Senate Majority Co-Leader, and you know, he indicated that he wants to continue coalition governance with the Republicans, you know, and yet earlier this year it seemed like the two factions of the Democrats had found a way to come back together. Do you feel that that compromise or that reconciliation, that you've been betrayed?
Well, look, the reality is the election results drive the conversation, and if we were in a situation where the Democratic Conference together with the Independent Democrats could form a majority, and then they did this, I would certainly feel betrayed at that point, because again, we would have the opportunity to achieve real results for the people. At this point in time, whatever political moves individuals make, the Republicans have the numbers. Whether Senator Klein is with them or with us or somewhere in between, Dean Skelos is going to be calling the shots in the next session, and probably the one after that, unless there's some changes between now and then. So I'm less concerned about it, given the fact that the outcome is going to be the outcome regardless of where people sit or stand or who they coalition with or not. But if we were, or if we get into a situation where that changes, then certainly it would be a big sticking point for us, because look, there's always changes between election day and the next election day. People retire, sometimes people get ill, unfortunately. We've certainly seen our share of convictions in the Senate, which create openings. Republicans only won 32 seats, right? They have a bare majority of 1. Even with all the tide coming against us, we still elected 31 Democrats in New York, and we're that close to getting it done. Now that means two things. Number one, in 2016, when it's a presidential year, we're almost certainly going to pick up those 1 or 2 seats and get to where we need to get. But even between now and then, if there's a vacancy in a special election, that dynamic can change very rapidly, and then we'll have to rehab this conversation all over again.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
The reality of what happens here in SOMOS, you mentioned the DREAM Act, which seems to be in the minds of many members of the Assembly and the Senate somehow the litmus test for what it is if you're for Latino. Now, the reality is the DREAM Act is not a priority for the general population in terms of Latino community. That's a reality, but some people are, you know, that's their horse to ride on. What is the real deal? You're on the Senate side, which seems to have been the stumbling block in getting this across, or at least that's what the governor and others use as an excuse. It didn't have the votes, it just missed by 1. In this climate, as you're entering 2015, would that just, what possible chance does it have of passing now that you're in the minority?
Well, it's a good question, and you have to say it has a lesser chance now than it had a year ago, when we actually had, even if we weren't governing together, we did have a majority of the body as Democrats. Right. The Republicans have been very clear. They campaigned against us on the DREAM Act all over upstate, and pretty viciously and in a gross manner, I would argue, misrepresenting people's positions and being pretty divisive about how they characterized it. But given that they think it works for their politics to be against it, it's obviously going to be harder. But that doesn't mean we're going to stop trying. We have allies in the Assembly. The governor says he wants it, and we'll do what we can to move the ball down the field.
But do you think that, or do you see any necessity to realign your priorities in any way to reflect the fact that the Republicans have grown their numbers in the state Senate? Because obviously the people don't want just a Senate that is just at ideological loggerheads where nothing gets done. I mean, are there points of compromise where you think that Republicans and your conference can work together to deliver real results for the people in New York?
I certainly hope so, but that's more up to them than it is up to us. We've proven, because we weren't in the governing position the last couple of years, that we can do that, whether it was lending our votes to the effort to have responsible gun laws in this state, or lending our votes to have same-sex marriage get enacted in New York. There are a host of issues on which we've proven we put the issues and the people above the politics. Now, whether the Republicans are willing to do that is up to them. Do they really want to stand up and say an increase in the minimum wage is something they don't want to support? I mean, we already compromised once to get an inadequate minimum wage hike. We'll do what we can to make sure that the people in New York, and I think to your point, Gerson, even the Latino community or the general community, economic issues, wage issues like that are critical across the board. And if the Republicans want to stand in the way of real progress for people so that they can actually provide for their families in the state, in the U.S. that's growing in terms of its income inequality by the day, then that's something they'll have to answer for. But if they're willing to compromise, we stand ready to talk to them.
You know, Senator Klein was questioning the tactics of the regular Democrats' campaign. That he said that, you know, instead of focusing on the things that you have achieved in concert, like the SAFE Act, like the minimum wage increase, as you say is inadequate, that it was about what hadn't been done. That was the focal point. That there was no DREAM Act. That there was not the 10 points to the women's equality agenda. And he said that voters reacted accordingly to this kind of the negatives as opposed to accentuating the positives.
Well, I'm not, at this point, I haven't seen the interview, so I don't want to respond to it, but
I
I
hope
will
that
say
I'm
this,
not mischaracterizing what he said.
Anyone that says we didn't focus on those real achievements wasn't paying attention to our campaigns, because I can bring in a host of literature and TV ads that show you exactly the opposite. So we're now at the point of, what's today, Saturday? We're Saturday morning quarterbacking off of Tuesday's results. And people are trying to kind of frame it in a way they want. I heard someone, read in the Daily News, that someone said, well, the Democrats were wrong because they focused on issues like public financing of campaigns. And I can't remember a single time when we did that. Others did on our behalf. Some of those that are being critical of us for doing that were the ones who were actually doing it. But you know, people are going to characterize things the way they want. The fact is, we ran strong campaigns. We ran fully funded campaigns, which we were in a unique position to do for the first time in many years, because the DSCC has gotten on a sound financial footing. And when you look at the results everywhere else, whether it's Congress people in New York, governors in very Democratic states around the country, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress, there's really, you look at it and say, and we've analyzed this for days now, there's really not a whole lot we could have done different to make an impact. We did everything we could. I wouldn't have second-guessed any decisions that we made, because you see what happened is there was a tide going on across the country, I think as the governor pointed out, that we were hard-pressed to fight back against.
You know, it's interesting you talk about outside groups. I mean, obviously this is a totally new electoral landscape over the last couple of cycles. You've had IEs that worked for you, you had IEs that certainly worked against you with huge amounts of money. I mean, has that just muddied and muddled the entire campaign system, that now you're saying, like, okay, people are accentuating a part of your accomplishments that wasn't necessarily your main focal point running DSCC? And so, you know, I wonder what your takeaway is from this back and forth with all these IEs.
Well, I mean, look, this is the world we live in after the Supreme Court did real damage to our democracy by allowing this to happen in the Citizens United case. And not just that the fact that the campaigns no longer control the messaging in some respects, but the sheer dollars that get spent in these races is obscene. $5 million plus in one Senate race that stretched from the Capital Region down to Ulster County was more than was spent in the entire state controller's race for the entire state. So the fact that all this money's coming in, people get saturated with these messages, and at some point it's overwhelming to them.
But it's not working.
Let me just ask one more question here, Gerson. About the state controller's race. I mean, we saw this pilot program. Bob Antonacci didn't qualify for the matching funds. to me, it seemed like that was always a pilot that was set up to be a failure, so that the Republicans could turn around and say, see, this doesn't work, right? I mean, do you think that that's how they're going to play it now? Do you think there's a chance that we can expand statewide campaign finance reform in this session? Or are they going to say, oh, look, Controller DiNapoli won by the largest margin of any candidate, so clearly this system is a failure?
Well, I mean, I think the problem with it is less the individual example of the controller's race than the fact that the Republicans who now have control of the Senate don't support it ideologically. And so, again, we have to climb uphill now and get it done, or try to get it done, and we'll certainly do that. But controller's race, you can't really say was a good test of a public financing system because there were no public funds expended in it. There really was no. It was just a regular election because no one. Controller DiNapoli wisely, I think, chose not to participate in what he deemed to be a system that was designed to fail. Not just him saying that, but the whole good government community. And the Republican candidate didn't qualify. So it really wasn't a test at all because it wasn't implemented there.
With the amount of money that has been spent, it's outlined there. It seems that it's not working. It may be working against the people that are defeated, and that you can point to that. But clearly, it's not stimulating additional people to come to the polls. That's clearly been
doing the opposite.
It's doing the opposite.
Right.
So having said that, is there a lesson here? You can never mind what they did. Is there a lesson for your party, for the Democrats, to say, wait a minute, the amount of money that the governor, the Democratic governor, had still didn't help him in achieving that? Tom DiNapoli, you point this back. Let's talk about Tom DiNapoli. He did better than the governor. It's going to turn out he has better numbers. He also has something that is very practical. Andrew Cuomo is not here. Neither is Eric Schneiderman. Tom DiNapoli, he has been here, participating in the SOMOS conference, being interviewed, participating in panels. And now is that, have we forgotten, or these people that get there, about the retail politics of this?
Well, I hope not, because as you point out, that's really the way to get to people. I mean, look, New York is a big state, 19 million people. You definitely need money to communicate your message because you can't meet all 19 million people by yourself.
Correct.
But there are things one can do to communicate at a grassroots level, and I think it's important to do that. But the money's a problem, and the real question is, what can we do about it? So there's direct money that candidates and the party committees control, and then there's the outside money. The outside money, the Supreme Court has told us we can't do anything about right now. So unless something happens in Washington unexpectedly and they start rolling it back, we're kind of stuck with that reality. What we can do is require more transparency, more disclosure, and we're doing that in New York. But the direct money we can affect, and a true system of campaign finance reform that puts a cap on spending by these campaigns, at least will control one aspect of it, because all told, when you add up all the numbers at the end of the day, it's probably half the total was spent directly and half was spent by independent.
How high is that in your agenda? I mean, there's a multitude of things that you have to deal with. How prominent is that on the agenda of you and other Democrats to do that, to limit the campaign?
It's high, but as we discussed earlier, it's going to be more of a challenge than ever. Our focus.
But it seems to be one of the major problems.
Well, yeah, it certainly is, and the process issues are always harder to deal with because the people have a tough time getting their hands around it.
Right.
I mean, you look at this redistricting reform proposal, which I don't think is reform at all, but people read the paragraph, it sounds nice, they voted for it in the end.
You voted on, one of the three, the first one being that supposedly alleged reform.
Exactly, but when you're dealing with real issues that affect people on a day-to-day basis, they feel that a lot more. So when you're talking about minimum wage or paid sick leave or some of the economic issues that affect people on a day-to-day basis, you're going to get more engagement from the public because it's more immediately important to them. It's a little bit more intellectual to make an argument that we need real redistricting reform or we need campaign finance reform. No less important to make those arguments, and we'll do it, and we'll try and achieve progress. But in terms of getting public support behind things, sometimes it's easier to deal with some of the more bread and butter issues.
You said earlier that you've broken down the numbers, you've done the postmortem, and that you feel like as head of DSCC that there was really not more that you could have done to win. I mean, I'm sure that some Democrats would take umbrage at that because by virtue of the results. You really think that there was nothing different that you could have done to change the outcome on Tuesday?
Well, you need to ask that question not only of us, but of the congressional Democrats in New York and nationally, the U.S. Senate Democrats, the governors who are running as Democrats this year. There comes a point in time, much like it was in '94, and I would argue that by the time we crunch these numbers down, this is going to have been a worse election than 1994 for Democrats across the country, that at the local level, there's only so much we can do to push against a tide like that. We actually picked up a Republican seat this year. We held a vulnerable Democrat as well. So everyone's focusing on the three we lost, but people have to realize we also picked up a seat. It could have been worse. and we protected some incumbents
But
that were under.
I'll give you an example. Like I think on the congressional level, there's a good argument to make that there was a real candidate recruitment failure with the Democrats. With some of the candidates like Dominic Recchia and Sean Eldridge. I mean, clearly, I feel like those were candidates who were picked because of their ability to raise money, as opposed to their ability to electrify their constituency, to have the bona fides there, to connect with the people. And that to me maybe speaks to a fundamental malfunction in the way that we're looking at politics. And I think it is because of the explosion of money that you're talking about, that the litmus test is how much money can you raise, not how much legitimacy you have with the people who you're looking to elect.
Well, I'm not in a position to speak about the congressional Democrats.
I'll talk to Steve Israel about that.
Exactly. We focus on the state Senate, but I think our candidates for the state Senate that we were fighting for on election day were great candidates. First of all, 3 of them were senators, right? So we were working hard to communicate their message and their accomplishments, which were many. And then we had some really good local activists, local officials around the state who were our candidates. It was just that when you get swamped in a nationwide dynamic like that, it's very hard to push back.
Yeah. State Senator Mike Gianaris, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us at the City and State 2014 SOMOS Hub. Always a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.